So I'm going to start recording now. And yeah, so I'll start just by introducing myself briefly. So my name is Hiba. I think a lot of you know me already. I'm a psychologist and a coach. I'm a health coach as well as a psychologist, so I have a background in integrative nutrition. And so I'm very interested in how to make change, how to make healthy change. And that's why I'm really interested in this topic around self-sabotage, because I've worked a lot with people around changing eating habits mostly. And self-sabotage seems to be very, very frequent in this kind of domain. And I will share a little bit about my own experience with self-sabotage, because I also wanted to talk about it because I know it quite intimately. And I'd love for you guys to share a little bit, maybe just some in the comments. I'll be asking questions as I go along. If you'd like to share a little bit about your own experience, that would be really cool as well. So I work mostly around habit change, eating habits, relationships, and emotions. And self-sabotage is a topic that really cuts through all of these topics, because it can come up with, as I mentioned before, changes to your eating habits, but also in relationships. For example, we know that someone is, a really great person for us to be in a relationship with, and yet we end up sabotaging that relationship as well. So self-sabotage is very common, and it's even sometimes very subtle, and we don't even notice it. And sometimes it's very obvious. And I would say it's very obvious when we have, a clear goal. For example, right now it's the new year. You might have had some New Year's resolutions, and maybe self-sabotage has come in, and you end up feeling like you've gotten in your own way, and just not been able to continue with that goal, or feel like you failed yet again. And so I think that this is a topic, especially at this time of year, which is very maybe very close to a lot of our hearts. So before I start talking about the more theoretical psychological aspects of self-sabotage, I want to share my experience just as an example of what this can look like. So when I was 29, I discovered that I had a genetic kidney disease, and this kind of freaked me out, as you can imagine. And one of my first reactions was, I need to completely revamp my diet and my lifestyle. And so I started to become really obsessed with healthy eating and healthy living. And that's also at the time that I studied integrative nutrition, and I started to become really, really focused on this topic. And then it seems like every week I would come up with a new plan. Like one week it would be, I'm going to completely cut out sugar. And the next week it was, I'm going to completely cut out gluten or dairy or whatever it was that week. And it would go pretty well for a few days. And then I would completely mess up, and I would just eat whatever was there. And usually it looked like, a colleague would bring in some cake, and I would just go crazy over that cake, even though I had sworn off sugar just a few days ago. And so my conclusion at the time was, I have no willpower, I have no discipline, I can't stick to anything that I decide to do. And that was really my conclusion. I thought that there was something wrong with me, and that I just wasn't capable of sticking to my health goals. Even though I knew what I wanted to do, it just seemed like I couldn't do it. And I would say that that's really the definition for me of self-sabotage. It's, you're at point A, and you know where you want to go. You want to go to point B. And yet it seems like between point A and point B, you just sort of get in your own way and do something to mess things up, and you can't keep up the change that you want to make. So yes, what's really going on when this happens? And I'm wondering at this stage, what kind of things would you say, what kind of changes or goals would you guys say that you experience self-sabotage with? I wonder if you'd like to maybe write something in the comments and share your experience with self-sabotage. It could be, around food or relationships, exercising, work. Yeah, so all the things that I've mentioned, cutting out sugar, etc. Yep, that sounds familiar. Yeah. Someone's saying as well, exercise, starting off exercising and then giving up after, yeah, and then giving up and not going anymore to the gym. Okay, someone's saying working from home. Yep, I know about that one as well. So when you want to get stuff done and you want to work from home and you're kind of your own boss and you probably get in your own way with that as well. Stop snacking after dinner. Start studies that I'm actually interested in, but somehow not pursuing them as I should. Okay, that's an interesting one. I think we'll get back to something like that a little bit later. Smoking. Quitting sugar. Yes. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all for sharing those. It's really, I think it's always really interesting how, I think that when we're in a situation like self-sabotage, we think like we're the only ones who face this kind of thing. And yet, just from these comments, it's really clear that we're all facing very similar challenges and in similar situations as well. So yeah, so thanks for sharing. So what I'd like to propose in this talk is that what if what's going on actually makes sense on some level? And what I mean by that is, instead of thinking like, there's something wrong with us, that we have to beat ourselves up and we have to kind of punish ourselves into making change and that there's something wrong with us, what if we instead took another approach, which is a little bit different and much more based around bringing some curiosity to what is actually showing up and what is actually going on. Einstein actually said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I really like this quote because I think it's very common when it comes to self-sabotage that we think there's something wrong with us, we just haven't tried hard enough. And so we just do the same thing, but we just bring in even more discipline, bring in even more effort, and we think that that's going to be the way that we're going to finally make the change that we want to make, right? I don't know if this is familiar to anyone here, but I know that was how I would relate to my goals when they didn't succeed, when I got in my own way. I would just bring in even more of the same kind of discipline, deprivation mindset that I was using to try to achieve those goals, which wasn't actually working. Stephen Hayes, the founder of ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, which is the approach that I use, he says something similar to Einstein, which is if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. It's a bit weird wording, but I think it's the same kind of idea that we tend to just do what we've always done, and the result is that we'll just get the same results as we've always gotten, which includes the self-sabotage. Because really, self-sabotage is showing up for a good reason. And this is what we're going to look into now, which is why is it actually showing up? What is really going on? So I'd like to suggest, this kind of reframe, this new way of looking at things is really about, instead of, beating yourself up and being like, oh, I'm so weak, I have no willpower, I have no discipline, to try instead to bring in this really curious, I wonder what's actually going on approach to your own situation as I talk through this. And just know, of course, that what I'm going to talk about is quite general. So it might not apply exactly to your situation, but hopefully there's some things that you might relate to. So I would really describe self-sabotage as I know what I want to do, but I keep getting in my own way. And for me, self-sabotage always, always, always has at its core an inner conflict. So what does that actually mean? What it means for me is that we think that we're this kind of whole person, that when I make a change, me, Hiba, I decide to make this change, I just do it. I decide, I do it, I'm one person, that's it. It's that simple, right? It seems that simple. But the reality is that we're actually made up of different parts. We have, if you'd like, different selves. There's a part of me that wants to make a change. There's another part of me that's resisting that change. There's sometimes when we have a difficult decision to make and we can't seem to make it, it's because, there's a part of you that has, some very positive emotions, and there's another part that has quite negative emotions about that same decision. And so we often have, conflicting emotions or conflicting reactions to a situation. In fact, I would say that we always have this sort of conflict in between these different parts of ourselves. And so that's why it can be really hard to make change. It's because we're not completely aligned in what we want to do when it comes to the different parts of ourselves. The American poet Walt Whitman in the 19th century actually wrote these lines, which I really like. He says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And I really love this idea of I contain multitudes, because suddenly it just makes more sense, why change would be so hard, why it's so hard to make decisions, why we seem to resist something that we know we should be excited about or we know is good for us. It's because we're made up of all these different parts, because we're large and we contain multitudes. So the way that I like to think of these multitudes is as an internal village. So if you think about your internal world, this is made up of thoughts, emotions. It's made up of needs, desires, and all these different parts can be like a villager. So we'd have a villager for anger, for example, or we have a villager for fear. And so we have all these different villagers that a bit like in the Disney movie, Pixar movie, Inside Out. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's actually a pretty good representation of the way that the human psyche works, which is made up of all these different parts. And lovely film, someone is saying. Yeah, I thought so too. I thought it was really well done. And it was actually, there's some really great psychologists who were involved in that movie to make it very realistic from the way that the mind actually works. And so the way that our internal village works, and my internal village, by the way, is called Hibbsville. And so the way that our internal villages work is that they're made up of all these villagers. And these villagers, even if they might seem really annoying sometimes or really even painful, they actually want what's best for our village. Like what they actually want is to protect or motivate us in some way. So they see their job description as keeping us safe. In ACT, we talk about the mind being a don't get killed machine. And that's really the main function, the main role of our internal village, is to make sure that we stay alive, that we survive, that we're protected from anything that might be a potential danger. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it's quite interesting because our minds are very negative. And from an evolutionary perspective, this really makes sense because if you think about, a cave woman is walking in the savannah and she sees a bit of movement in the bush. If she jumps to the worst case conclusion and thinks, oh my gosh, it's a lion, and runs away, this probably increased her chances of staying alive. And also, we also know now from evolutionary psychology that our ancestors were not the ones who were, sitting around a campfire and singing Kumbaya and being all kind of, hippie and very kind of free-spirited. Our ancestors were probably the ones who were really paranoid about their lion and ran away and escaped, and then sat in their caves thinking about all the ways that they could avoid, getting killed by the lion. So they were the ones who had anxiety. And so there's probably some kind of selection around the minds that were the most negative and the most anxious, the most paranoid, were actually the ones that survived and who became us today, modern humans. So it actually makes sense that, in a way, that it is hard to make change because change from the mind's perspective, from our internal village's perspective, is all about the unknown. So we don't know what's going to happen with change, even positive change, even like a change that we think we really, really want, like losing weight. We still don't really know what that's going to be like because we know very well what it's like right now, but we're not really sure what it could be like in the future. And so any change, no matter how positive, is always going to imply the unknown. And that will always, to some degree, make our internal village freak out, or some villagers in that village freak out. And so we actually evolved to resist change until the pain of not changing became greater than the pain of changing. So I don't know if this makes sense up until now, if it makes sense to think of change in that way, to think of it as being quite hard for us as humans, that it's not something that comes naturally, that change is something that we tend to resist more than move towards from an evolutionary perspective, because the mind is very conservative and just wants to kind of keep us safe and not have us make any major changes, because that's, you know, the unknown. And so we tend to be quite conservative and quite negative in our way of thinking. And so when it comes to self-sabotage in particular, so there's a change that we want to make. We have at least 2 villagers, which I will talk about, that start to freak out about this change. And they get into a conflict. So it almost becomes like a civil war in the internal village between these 2 villagers. And before I go into these villagers, I just want to point out that every villager in the village has a role, a specific job description. It's mostly around, as I said before, a don't get killed machine. So mostly around protecting you from any potential danger, even change, or a way of motivating you to get better, to do better, so that you could also stay alive and get love, or whatever that villager thinks that you need. And each of the villagers that I'm going to talk about, they showed up for a good reason at a certain point in your childhood, in our childhoods, in our developments. And usually they show up at a time where they're actually really useful. So, for example, if you have a very perfectionistic villager, that villager might have shown up because you had a very critical parent, and being as perfect as possible was a way of avoiding criticism. And that doesn't mean that now we can't do anything to change that behavior, to change that villager, but it does mean that there's always a good reason for, why we do what we do. And I think it's really important to bring ourselves some understanding and compassion about that, that we're not doing things as a way of, because we're weak. We're doing it because there's actually a good reason for it. So I want to talk about the 2 villagers that are really involved in self-sabotage. And the first one is one that I think you might have met in your own village. And this is the one that I'm calling boot camp villager. Someone earlier in the comments called their version of this the Punisher. So, and I know that there's also like images around like a really strict school teacher type image, or a really strict parent. This is like a voice of authority. So this is the first villager that we have when it comes to self-sabotage. And this is the villager who usually makes a choice: we need to change. We need to do something differently. We need to, change our diet. We need to get this work done. We need to exercise 5 times a week. And it's this kind of villager uses harshness and discipline to try to get us to do something. And there's often beliefs around for this villager, which sound a little bit like, if it isn't hard, I'm not doing it right. I have to deprive myself. I have to eat or exercise or do whatever perfectly, otherwise I'm not enough. No pain, no gain, hence the boot camp villager name. And I need to be hard on myself to move forward. And this villager, and it's interesting because a few of you commented as well with what this villager sounds like for you. And there's a lot of shoulds in the language that you're using. And this is very common with this villager, the boot camp villager. There's always often words like I should do this, I have to do this, I need to do this. And these words always imply a sense of obligation. So that there's like no choice. I have to do this. I have to cut out sugar. I need to cut out sugar. I should cut out sugar. Whichever one you use, maybe you can get a sense that, there's no choice. And it's almost like I'm pushing you against the wall, and there's like no sense of being able to choose, and you're just forced to make this change. So there's definitely an element of self-forcing that comes with this part of us, with bootcamp villager. And bootcamp villager sees their job description as needing to motivate us to be better. So they have, good intentions, like all villagers, they have good intentions, but they go about them in sort of a clumsy, not always very effective way. And so bootcamp villager usually comes from childhood, where there was a quite strict, maybe strict parental figure who spoke to us in this way, in this kind of, you have to do this, you should do this, kind of a lot of sense of obligation, forcing, not to blame parents, but just to explain where this comes from. It's very cultural as well. I think it's very much kind of the societal idea that you need to be hard on yourself in order to make change. So I feel like bootcamp villager is also, in our society, a very clear reflection of that as well. And and bootcamp villager really has this good intention of, I want you to improve so that you can be better, you can be a better person. And often the deeper motivation behind that is, so you can be a better person, so that you can fit in, so you can get love, so you can belong. And so there's really I would say, really innocent needs behind it. It comes from a very pure intention. Except that the way that this villager goes about making these changes is through, discipline, deprivation, being really critical, really harsh. This is the villager that will tell you, look at you, you look so fat. What are you thinking? You need to lose weight. How can you eat that cake? That kind of voice, that kind of way of talking. And just thinking that just by kind of whipping us into shape, that we'll be able to make changes. Bootcamp villager also often has an element of people pleasing and making decisions based on what I call fog, so fear, obligation, and guilt, or guilt. And so there's often an element of not enough that comes with bootcamp villager. There's often this idea that, I'm not enough, and so I need to make this change in order to become enough, in order to be loved, in order to get the love and belonging that I'm craving. And so as you can see, there's also very often a lot of kind of black and white thinking. You either cut out all sugar, or you just, there's no in between. You go from cold turkey, you quit cold turkey from one day to the next. This is the way that bootcamp villager usually thinks. There's often very extreme changes that this villager wants us to make, and also very ambitious. There's and in a way, it doesn't seem like a bad thing to be ambitious, to want to make changes, but the reality is that often it doesn't work, and often we're trying to follow these really rigid rules that this bootcamp villager comes up with. And it often, even when it works, there's a very high price of just being really exhausted and not feeling good about the change, because it's come from a place of not enough, of lack of, I don't like myself, and so I need to change. And this can be anything that's very extreme and unrealistic, like we mentioned, the completely cutting out sugar, or like dry January, where you just don't drink at all in January, or going on a 40-day juice fast, or anything like that, which might seem like such a great idea in the beginning, but actually feels really harsh and really very filled with deprivation and just like really harsh discipline. So I'm wondering now, I'm going to pause for a little bit and ask you guys, can you relate to bootcamp villager? Is this like a part of yourself that you recognize when you're trying to make change, and you notice that self-sabotage behavior shows up? Yes. Completely relate. Yep. So there's a lot of yeses coming up, and definitely, and I can completely relate. Okay, cool. So what would you say is the effect of bootcamp villager? Like, does it actually work to be able to, oh, wow. Someone's saying that she yesterday decided to have zero alcohol until July. Oof. Bootcamp villager is really stepping in there until July. Wow. Okay. Totally a boot camper, someone's saying as well. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm wondering, so for those of you who recognize yourselves with Bootcamp Villager, and I want to point out as well that some of us have more of a Bootcamp Villager than others do. Others have more of the other villager, which I'm going to talk about next. And yeah, so what would you say the effect of Bootcamp Villager is? Does it work to make the changes that you want to make in your life? Yeah, someone's saying, just makes me feel bad about myself for a short period. And I think that's exactly why we keep doing it. And someone's saying, yes, and sometimes there's a place for it. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point as well. And I will get back to that. Okay, well, so that's nice. Someone's saying that, yeah, she used to be a boot camper, but now practices more self-compassion. That's awesome. Yeah, and tired. Yes, yes, I think that's exactly it, the whole tired thing. Yeah, and temporarily it works, but makes me feel never good enough. And I think that's exactly the way that we feel with Bootcamp Villager, is that the thing with Bootcamp Villager is that it does work in the short term. For some of us, it works longer. Like, I think that some of us have more discipline than others. And for those of us, it can work more in the short term, more in maybe short, medium term. But often in the long term, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because Bootcamp Villager has a nemesis, like sort of an enemy that shows up when Bootcamp Villager tries to run our village. And that villager who just rebels against Bootcamp Villager is called Club Med Villager. So I don't know if you guys know Club Med, but I think everyone knows Club Med, yes? So Club Med Villager is the one who's, like Club Med is like that, really nice holiday place. And that sort of, everything's fine with the world. I don't need to think about anything. Everything's kind of pre-booked. And so Club Med Villager is the nemesis, the enemy of Bootcamp Villager. And Club Med Villager will always show up, guaranteed, as soon as Bootcamp Villager tries to run the village. Because Club Med Villager does not want to live in this horrible village where Bootcamp Villager is taking over, right? And so they want to protect us, to protect the village in some way from the dictatorship of Bootcamp Villager. Because I think most of you will agree that, Bootcamp Villager is not a fun villager. And when they take over the village, it's not a cool place to be, right? A few of you mentioned being tired and sorry, I just need to mute someone. Yeah. So it's interesting because Bootcamp Villager has very different language, very different beliefs and different way of speaking than, Club Med Villager has a very different way of speaking and believing and beliefs that run their way of being, which are things like, it shouldn't be so hard. I don't have to be trying so hard. I deserve a treat. Who cares if I don't achieve my health goal? I just want to feel good right now. Oh, it's just one piece of cake. Who cares? It doesn't matter anyway. What the hell? It's that kind of, that sort of very permissive, very free-spirited, kind of wild kind of villager. And so their job description is also, again, like Bootcamp Villager, Club Med Villager also showed up for a good reason in our village, usually often as a reaction to Club Med Villager. So often if we had, very strict parental authority, or we just grew up in a very strict environment, maybe it was through school or whatever, we often have a Club Med villager who came about as a way of trying to restore the balance and to try to make the village a little bit more fun and playful and just not as, just horrible boot camp place to live in. Most of all, and from a more psychological perspective, I would say that Club Med villager, their role is to protect you from the discomfort that comes from change. Because as I mentioned before, any kind of change leads to a lot of discomfort. And this discomfort can be physical discomfort, like the feeling of hunger or cravings or, like the effort needed to go to the gym. And also deprivation, like drives Club Med villager crazy. They hate any bit of deprivation. Like as soon as there's even the hint that there could be deprivation, Club Med villager will take over the village and be like, no, we're not doing that. And just like make you do things like, just binge or just stop going to the gym or not do any work, like procrastinate. So what we perceive as self-sabotage is often Club Med villager taking over the village. And usually what Club Med villager is doing is reacting to bootcamp villager and just doing the opposite of what bootcamp villager wants us to do. And so whenever there's a bootcamp villager, there will be a Club Med villager. They're like two sides of the same coin. You can't really have one without the other. And in particular, Club Med villager sees their role as protecting us from three kinds of discomfort. The first one is what I just mentioned, that they're simply reacting to bootcamp villager because any kind of forcing yourself to do something will lead to self-sabotage, guaranteed. So if there's nothing else that you take from this talk, this is, I think, the most important thing. As soon as you try to force yourself to do something and you make it an obligation, you will sabotage yourself. Self-forcing equals self-sabotage. That is like really something that is very common, and it's very normal as well as humans, because there's nothing that we hate more than other people telling us what to do than telling ourselves what to do. So, I mean, maybe you notice even in like your relationships, when someone nags at you to, to do the dishes, you just don't want to do them because they're nagging at you and feels like an obligation. You're like, I don't want to do it. Like, even if you don't really mind doing it, you might not do it just as a way of rebelling in a way. So we all have that little bit of a rebel in us. It's not unhealthy, but it's something that we need to learn how to work with when we want to make changes. So the second way that Club Med villager steps in and tries to protect us through self-sabotage is actually when the goal is too big and there's too much change all at once. And this is often the case when bootcamp villager is taking over. Club Med villager will panic and be like, no, that's too much. It's too scary. There's too much unknown. And then we'll do something to stop us from making that change. And we will perceive that as self-sabotage when really it's the fear of the changes because there's just too much that we're trying to do at once, where the change just feels too big and too scary. And so we prefer to protect ourselves from that rather than taking the risk of making that change. And the third way that Club Med villager tries to protect us is when Club Med villager feels that what bootcamp villager wants to do is not important enough for us, that it's not really what we want to do, that maybe, maybe making this change is not important enough to us. For example, someone here in the comments mentioned wanting to study for something. Sometimes, and I've worked with someone in the past who was trying to force herself to do a degree in something, and it turned out that it just wasn't important enough for her anymore. Like, it had been important when she signed up for it a few years ago, but now it was no longer so important, and so she kept sabotaging herself through procrastination, putting it off, just not getting to it. And when she realized that, well, actually, it's not important enough for me, she was able to change and do something that was much more aligned with her values and who she wanted to be today. So that's another way that often it's really that simple. It's just that it doesn't matter enough to me to make this change. And so Club Med Villager will step in, and usually when it's not important enough, it's more around procrastination, putting something off, not doing it. And often people will say, I'm just really lazy. But I don't believe that lazy really exists. I think it's actually often, it doesn't actually matter enough to me to do it. Or I'm scared. So those are the two things that are often behind Club Med Villager and self-sabotage is this is too much for me, the change is scary, or I'm rebelling against the sense of obligation. I don't feel like I'm choosing this to make this change, or this just doesn't matter enough to me. It's not part of my values. And sometimes, yeah, and I think often we need to be really, really mindful of, are we making a change because it really matters to us, or are we doing it because, just we think we should, or it's just what we've always been told, or like we like the idea, but we're not actually willing to have the full experience of it. For example, we like the idea of having a perfect body, but we're not willing to have the discomfort of going to the gym every day and working out and sculpting our body the way that we would need to have that ideal body. And so it actually doesn't matter enough to us. But what we think and what we tell ourselves is that, oh, I'm just lazy and I can't seem to do it. So again, just coming back to this idea that there's always a good reason for why we do what we do, including self-sabotage. So I'm wondering at this point, can you guys relate to Club Med Villager as well? Is this a villager who shows up for you too? Yeah, lots of yeses regularly. It's really me, totally. Okay, cool. So yeah, and maybe you've noticed as well that Club Med Villager is not very effective to make changes either. We think that Bootcamp Villager is more effective than Club Med Villager, but actually neither of them is very effective in the long term, because this is the way it actually looks like. So if you think about a pendulum, so I have a pendulum here, and you think about Club Med Villager is like, this is Club Med Villager, and we're holding self-discipline, deprivation, willpower with, really strongly in this side. But at one point we have to let go because it's just too tiring and it's too much and we can't keep it up in the long term. And so we let go and we swing all the way to the other extreme. And this is Club Med Villager, and this is like letting go and just doing whatever, who cares. There's an effect in psychology which is actually called the what the hell effect. And this is, or falling off the bandwagon, or whatever you want to call it. This is the Club Med situation going on here. So at one point, this feels pretty good in the short term because, we feel free, we feel like we can just do whatever. There's no obligation that, all the sense of obligation that we had with Bootcamp Villager. But at one point, we're like, no, this can't go on any longer. Bootcamp Villager steps in, takes back control, and we end up swinging from one extreme to the other, and it just goes on like this. So this is the pendulum effect. So my solution, or what I'd like to propose, is that neither extreme is healthy. We can't allow either one of these villagers to run the village in the long term, and we need to actually let go of the pendulum. So if we let go of the pendulum, it kind of, it might sort of move around a little bit before it settles in the middle. But once it settles in the middle, we're not in Bootcamp Villager extreme, nor in Club Med Villager extreme anymore. We're in this middle place. The Buddhists talk a lot about the middle way, that sort of sense of moderation. And this middle way is actually where we can find real freedom and a much kinder, more compassionate way of making changes that doesn't come from either extreme, but comes instead from another part of us, which I'm calling the wise village chief. So if you think about your village, you also have this leader of the village who's the wise village chief. And this village chief is about making decisions that are what's best for you. So treating yourself like you would, a really good friend, someone you really cared about, and making decisions that are kind and compassionate and wise. And also, and this is really important, realistic. Because what we know about boot camp villagers is that they're not realistic in what they want for us. It's often like way too big goals, very excessive, very extreme. Whereas the wise village chief is about, smaller goals, more realistic, doing things that really matter to us and never forcing us. And this is super important as well. Because as soon as we try to force ourselves, there will be sabotage. Like I said before, self-forcing leads to self-sabotage. And so the wise village chief is not about, just being really kind to ourselves, being like, oh, it's okay, darling, you don't need to do this. You don't need to eat healthy. You don't need to go to the gym. You don't need to do that work, whatever it is. It's not about that at all, because for those of you who have children, you probably know that if you love a child, you don't allow them to just do whatever, right? You're quite tough on them because you love them. And this is the way that the wise village chief is with us as well. This is the way that we can treat ourselves. It's actually being able to make the tough choices when we need to, but always, always, always from a place of, of compassion and kindness towards ourselves, and not from a place of, I'm not enough and so I have to change, but instead from a place of, I am enough as I am right now, and I still want to do even better. So it's really starting from a very different point than boot camp villager, which is like, I'm not enough, I have to improve so that I can be loved, so I can do this. From this wise village chief perspective, it's much more around, I am enough and I want more for me because I really care about myself. So before I go further, I want to do a little caveat, which is to say that this is not natural for us as humans, to be kind to ourselves, to be compassionate to ourselves. It's actually a lot more natural for us to be kind to other people. And again, from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense because being kind to other people in our tribe, in our social group, actually helped us survive in a way, because that we made sure that we weren't being kicked out of the social group. So being kind to ourselves wasn't really something that comes naturally to us, but we do know how to do it because we're able to do it with other people. And so in a way, treating ourselves like we would someone that we really cared about is a really good way to start bringing this sense of kindness and compassion to ourselves. And I want to also point out that you don't need to, this is not about, looking in the mirror and doing affirmations and loving yourself. Although if you want to do that too, that's cool. But what I mean more is it's actually just taking the actions that you would if you really cared about yourself. And so you don't need to believe it. You don't need to believe that you're worth taking care of. You don't need to feel it. It's not a feeling. It's not an emotion that you're following. It's actually a choice. It's just a choice. It's an action or a set of actions that you can take. And often, what research in social psychology shows is that acting as if you were someone that you really cared about, asking yourself, how would I treat someone I really cared about in this situation? That is often a much more effective way of making change than waiting to feel inspired or to feel a certain way before doing something. And this is true for any kind of change, not just, around self-sabotage, but any kind of change, acting as if, or, faking it until you become it, as Amy Cuddy says. This is something that's really effective in making change. And so I'm going to suggest 3 ways that you can actually sort of counter the effects of what we saw with the dynamic between bootcamp villager and then Club Med villager, and just sort of take these 3 points and really conclude some ways of how you can bring to life this wise village chief part of you, which I really believe that we all have, but that sometimes is hard to access because we're not used to, we're just not used to it. But you can also call it, listening to your heart, listening to your intuition. It's just really about wanting what's best for yourself. I have a friend who talks about her head of the village, as the chiefess, and I really love that. So this is she's a female chief, so she calls her the chiefess. But a lot of my clients have kind of male African tribe leader type chiefs, or just any kind of inspiring figure. Mine is actually kind of I don't know, she looks kind of like a Greek goddess with like a long flowing white robe, and she has a very calm and soothing voice. So it really depends on who you feel inspires you, like what kind of image would inspire you as your wise village chief. And what's really important with the wise village chief is that the wise village chief, even though they're the ones who are supposed to be running the village, if we want to be living in a way that's harmonious and wise and in line with our values, they still can't get rid of any of the villagers, any of the other villagers. So they can't just, get rid of boot camp villager or club med villager. They're going to be there anyway. They will always be there. And so the role of the chief of the village as the leader of the village is actually to reassure both villagers that I've got this. You don't need to take over the village. I've got this. I can do this. You don't need to, step in and do your, boot camp treatment and then the self-sabotage thing. You guys don't need to do that anymore. I've got this. I can take care of the village. I can take care of this person. And the way that this chief is going to do it when it comes to a self-sabotage situation is that they need to, at the same time, reassure boot camp villager that we're still moving forward, we're making changes, we're progressing, we're doing something. This is really important because, boot camp villager is all about motivating you to do better, to be better, and all that. And at the same time, the wise village chief needs to reassure club med villager that it's okay, we're safe, there's no need to panic, we're not being overrun by discipline and harshness, and the village is not going to become this horrible place with only discomfort and no fun. So it's really important to reassure both that, we're moving forward and it's safe. We're not making these massive changes that are really harsh and not cool. So the 3 ways I want to suggest. The first one is to drop the self-forcing, which always will lead to self-sabotage. So what this actually means is to realize that if we don't have an obligation to do something, then we can always choose to do it from a place of choice. Sorry. So from this place of choice, we can actually choose to do the same thing as we would be doing with bootcamp villager, but when we're choosing to do it, it's very different. It feels so different. So for example, if one of the examples was I should cut out sugar that one of you shared. So if you remove the should in that statement, because should, need to, have to always imply a sense of obligation, of not having any choice, and we replace that should with a could. I could cut out sugar, if it really matters to me, if I want to. That suddenly completely shifts even the energy of that statement. I feel like, I should cut out sugar versus I could cut out sugar. And all of a sudden you replace this obligation, you transform it into a choice. And when we have a choice, we don't feel like we need to rebel against something. We don't feel like we need to sabotage it just because someone is trying to force us, even if it's a part of ourselves, to do something. So that's the first thing, first way that the wise village chief could take over, is actually by making sure that instead of obligations, everything becomes a choice. Because the reality is, and I'm not going to go into this too much, but we always have the choice. There's nothing in this world, in this life, that we have to do. Everyone always says, yeah, but I have to go to work. Well, actually, you don't. You could choose to not go to work. You could choose to not work at all. But there are consequences. There's always a choice, and there are consequences. So if we're not willing to face the consequences, it doesn't mean that there's no choice. It just means that we don't like the consequences, so we're not choosing to not go to work. The second way that we can bring in the wise village chief is asking ourselves, does this really matter to me? And this, again, is really important because, like, what are my values? Who or what is important to me in this situation? And does it matter to me enough to make room for the discomfort that will come with making a change? Because the reality is, and I'm sorry, Club Med Villager, because you hate discomfort, but every change implies a certain amount of discomfort. And when we can't make a change, it's often because it's not the discomfort that's part of that experience is not important enough for us in relation to the values that we have. It's almost like a scale if you think about it. So the values that you have around it, why it matters to you, has to be more important than the discomfort that shows up. So for example, if, waking up at 5 a.m. and going to the gym every morning is like way too much discomfort for how important it is for you to have the perfect body, then you're not going to do it. And it's almost like physics, And the more that we force ourselves to try to do it, it's just never going to work because it doesn't matter enough to you. So it's really important to ask yourself that, does it matter enough to me? And if it does, how can you make it even more motivating to you? Like, what is it exactly about that matters to you? Like for example, for me, when I was making changes to my eating, it was a lot about, building trust of my body. And that for me was really motivating. It might not be motivating for you, and that's fine. But that for me was much more motivating than having a perfect body or anything like that. So it was much more about, building trust in my body and feeling, feeling comfortable in my skin. And the last point I want to make around how to bring in the wise village chief is not to bring in too much change all at once, which is what bootcamp villager will try to do. So instead, you can think of, what is the smallest, kindest step that I can take towards this value that I have, or towards this goal. And sometimes this can actually look like really breaking down what you thought you needed to do. Like if you want to, for example, eat more healthy, it can just look like, adding one vegetable to one meal every day, like something really tiny. You can even, think of it as ridiculously small steps that feel almost too easy. But those are really, really important because they're a way of kind of sneaking up on Club Med villagers that he doesn't freak out about, oh my gosh, there's so much change, so much discomfort. I need to self-sabotage. And so this is a really good way, is like actually really tiny steps and then building up on them. So starting with just one vegetable and one meal a day, and then maybe adding a second vegetable. Once you have that, once that's a habit, then adding a second vegetable, for example, or doing something else, like making a batch of quinoa for the week or just something like that. But just one really tiny step and just starting there. And so this is a really good way of acting as if, as I mentioned before, of acting as if you want what's best for you, and just asking yourself, what is the kind choice in the situation? What would the kind decision be? Is it actually completely not drinking until July? Does that feel kind to me? And it might, and it might not. And this is the thing about the wise village chief, is that it will totally depend on each situation. It's very much, in the moment. There's no rules, because bootcamp village is all about rules. But the wise village chief is all about listening to yourself in the moment and making choices kind of in real time. And then finally, just really bringing a more kind of kind and compassionate approach to yourself as you're making change. And this can also help to avoid self-sabotage. So actually bringing a lot of kindness to yourself, like telling yourself, it's okay to take your time, change is hard. Just kind of admitting that. It's okay not to do things perfectly, almost giving yourself permission to not be perfect. And realizing that change is not linear. We don't just make changes like this. It's more like, like little waves of the ocean. Sometimes we move forward, sometimes we move a little bit back, and it's all okay. We can actually choose to see it all as a learning and not get all hung up over, oh my gosh, I failed, I'm such a failure, and beating ourselves up. But simply noticing, okay, that didn't work out. What can I learn from it? And what do I need to do, or how can I help myself moving forward? And so finally, I want to just finish this talk with a question that you can ask yourself, which can be a lot more helpful than this kind of beating yourself up when you do, not when you don't reach your goals or when you sabotage yourself, which is actually just admitting to yourself that it makes sense on some level, just knowing this dynamic between boot camp and Club Med Villager, and knowing as well that change is hard for humans, that, for example, with making changes to your diet, sugar is very addictive. A lot of us had very strict upbringings around food, and that makes it really hard because the brain is wired a certain way. And so just starting by admitting, it makes sense that I would react this way, or it's understandable that I would react this way. And how can I best support myself in making this change? So really, I'll say this again. So really just admitting to yourself that it's understandable, sort of validating your experience, and then asking yourself what you need to make the changes that you want to make. So I'll just state that again. So it makes sense that I would react this way. How can I best support myself in making this change? And I wonder when I say that, like, what shows up for you? Because I feel like for me, this statement, it's something I use a lot with myself. How can I best support you in this moment? And not said in like a mean way, like Bootcamp Villager would say it, but said, with real kindness, how can I best support you as you're making this changes? What do you need right now in this moment? What is the kind choice? That's something that instead of being in self-blame and beating ourselves up, it really opens up, all these choices and the possibilities of, what do I need? Do I need to ask for help? Do I need to get better information? Do I need to organize myself better? And it just sort of makes us curious about, well, what's actually going on and what do I need in this moment? And I can guarantee that what we need is not to beat ourselves up and be critical with ourselves, because it just never helps, never. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. So just realizing that behind self-sabotage, there's always a good reason, there's always something going on. And it's not that you're weak, and it's not that you're lazy, and it's not that there's something wrong with you, but it's often the sense of self-forcing that comes from Bootcamp Villager. And then you have the Club Med Villager who's reacting to Bootcamp Villager. And as long as you stay in that dynamic, you can never win, because they're just two sides of the same coin, and they will always trigger each other. And so instead, letting go of that pendulum and stepping into this new way of relating to yourself, which is from this place of the wise village chief, and tapping into this part of you that's wise and wants what's best for you, and not needing to believe that you deserve it, not needing to believe that you deserve kindness, but simply making choices and taking action steps towards it anyway. And realizing that thoughts are just thoughts. They're not the truth. They're not facts, and that we don't need to feel a certain way before we do something. That we can just make that choice and do it anyway. So that's it. I'm wondering if you have any questions or comments. I hope that you found this useful. So someone is asking, how can I expedite the wise village chief? I know it takes time. Yes, it does take time, because it's a very new way of relating to ourselves. And the other ways are very ingrained. They were there probably since childhood. And so it's really important to bring a lot of patience and compassion to yourself, even as you're bringing compassion to yourself, and not just realizing that it does take time, and that's okay. And just starting small. Yeah, oh, that's cool. So people are saying that this made sense to them. That was a good reminder. Cool, and I hope that there's something that you can take away from this. And I wanted to mention that if you guys are, I think most of you are probably signed up to my newsletter, and if you're not, I'll send the link with the video of this talk. And I also wanted to mention that, I work in Geneva and Lausanne, and also over Skype or this platform for individual sessions. So if you want help with any of the villagers or all of the villagers, or even just, stepping more fully into the wise village chief and working more self-compassion as a very different way of making changes and relating to yourself, yeah, just please get in touch. And yeah, I hope to see you at other events. I'm currently planning, I have my new website, wiserhumans.com. And I'm actually planning some new events, which are very different from what I've done in the past. So I hope you'll stay tuned for those. Cool. I'm glad everyone's commenting and everything. Yeah, someone's saying, I really liked, how can I best support myself? Yes, I love that too. I think it's actually from compassion-focused therapy, which is one of the approaches I use. And I find it super helpful as well, because it really just broadens your options and takes you out of the threat mode of just beating yourself up. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of the evening. And please be kind to yourselves and tap into your wise village chief, who I know is there. Thank you.